actions of the terrorists involved. Thousands took to social media to declare the atrocities were not done in their name or in the name of their faith. Despite this, the 2016 campaign trail has boiled over with rhetoric that feeds into fear-mongering over Islam.
You know, if there's a rabid dog running around in your neighborhood, you're probably not going to assume something good about that dog.
Should there be a database system that tracks the Muslims here in this country?
There should be a lot of systems beyond database. I mean, we should have a lot of systems.
And that may be having an impact on the psyche of the American public. When polled, 56% of Americans say the values of Islam are at odds with America's values and way of life, a 9-point increase in just 3 years. And as the last few days have centered on Syrian refugees entering the country, 38% of respondents in our NBC News SurveyMonkey poll say they strongly disapprove of the decision to increase the number of refugees coming into the United States. Joining me now is Dalia Mogahed, the co-author who speaks for Islam and the director of research at the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. Dalia, thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
So why do you think the United States is having a different reaction today to Muslim Americans than they did after 9/11?
I think it's a difference in leadership. We have to, whatever policy differences we might have with George W. Bush, he really took a moral stance after 9/11 and made the strong case for the fact that these attacks were carried out by terrorists, by criminals, and that an entire faith group should not be blamed for them. Unfortunately, what's happening today, because of an election season, we have people capitalizing on Americans' fears to win votes and to push forward bad policies.
What? Let me just have you do some of the basics. You saw there, 56% of Americans say that Islam is not part of the American way of life.
Right.
Tell them why they're wrong.
Well, why they're wrong is because 7 million Americans consider Islam their faith, and they are law-abiding citizens. They contribute to this country. They are job creators. They are doctors, lawyers. They are the most likely faith group in America, actually, to say that attacks on civilians are never justified. What's interesting is the timing of this poll. When you look over the past 14 years, you notice something very interesting. The spikes in anti-Muslim sentiment among the American public do not correlate with actual terrorist attacks. Now, in this case, of course, ISIS is an exception. But before ISIS came on the scene, the Boston bombing did not increase anti-Muslim sentiment even by 1 point. Even 9/11 did not increase anti-Muslim sentiment. What does increase, what does correlate with anti-Muslim sentiment is the run-up to the Iraq War and the 2008 and 2012 elections. So anti-Muslim sentiment is a manufactured
It's a political phenomenon. You believe it's a political phenomenon, a campaign phenomenon, and nothing else.
It is. It is a domestic issue around elections and around the drum-up to bad decisions like the Iraq War.
So let me ask you the question that you were supposed to be asked, or you were supposed to answer in your book. Who speaks for Islam? Because that does seem to be part of this debate. And it's sort of like when you hear, you will hear American leaders going, we need more Muslim leaders to speak out against ISIS, to speak out against Al-Qaeda, to speak out against these radicals who are trying to pervert your faith.
Right. The question we asked in the book, Who Speaks for Islam, is based on the idea that a fringe minority claims to speak on Islam, and that we're ignoring the silenced majority. And it's not that they aren't speaking out, it's that we're not listening.
It was interesting you said silenced.
Silenced.
Yeah, not silent.
No,
you feel like they have been
silent.
silenced. Who has silenced them? You think
Well,
we're not doing enough to
vocal extremists have silenced them. A media that isn't interested in the mainstream has silenced them. But when you actually ask the vast majority of Muslims, you find that our values are very compatible, that they are at least as likely, if not more likely, to condemn terrorism. But I think we should take a step back and ask a different question, which is it justified to demand that Muslims condemn terrorism? Now, that might sound a little radical, just in even asking it.
All right.
And the reason I say that is this. Condoning the killing of civilians is, to me, about the most monstrous thing you can do. And to be suspected of doing something so monstrous simply because of your faith seems very unfair. Now, when you look at the majority of terrorist attacks in the United States, according to the FBI, the majority of domestic terrorist attacks are actually committed by white male Christians. Now, that's just the facts. When those things occur, we don't suspect other people who share their faith and ethnicity of condoning them. We assume that these things outrage them just as much as they do anyone else. And we have to afford that same assumption of innocence to Muslims.
If you could say one thing to Donald Trump, what would you say to him?
I would say you don't understand the Constitution and you are wrecking freedom in America.
And what would you tell him to read or do to understand Islam?
I don't want him to understand Islam. I want him to understand the Constitution, because he's getting that wrong. Even he doesn't have to like Muslims or like Islam or understand Islam. But what I do expect of a presidential candidate is to conduct himself according to the basic principles of constitutional law. And to suggest something like registering people according to their faith is absolutely outrageous. And the rhetoric we're hearing today should alarm every American. This is not about Muslims. This is not about the 1%. This is about the 100%. It's about every American who cares about freedom and democracy in this country, because our rhetoric is a reflection of the quality of our democracy. And I think that right now we are in a lot of trouble.
The Russian military has released new footage of their overnight onslaught against ISIS. The Russian Defense Ministry says these cruise missiles that were launched from the Caspian Sea hit their intended terrorist targets in Raqqa and Aleppo. And their defense ministry put out this video, which shows Russian military members writing "for Paris" and "for ours" on the bombs they dropped on ISIS. Russia's involvement comes as France increases its series of airstrikes against ISIS and builds support for military assistance within and outside the EU. French President Francois Hollande is now taking on the role of bridge builder with back-to-back trips next week to Washington and then to Moscow. Is this the start of a new anti-ISIS coalition that could include the U.S. and Russia? Or will the two countries continue their own strategies against ISIS? Joining me now to discuss this more is Les Brownlee. He's a retired Army colonel and former acting Secretary of Army under President George W. Bush. Les, thanks for coming in. So let me start with the basic question here. France is trying to get the U.S. and Russia on the same page with them. Is this the right coalition to take on ISIS? And can the U.S. and Russia work together?
Well, I think at the operational level, certainly our military forces can work together. They've done that in the past. And they've done that in some special cases even since World War II. Mm-hmm. And those things can be worked out. Our military forces will know how to do that. But keep in mind, coalitions require strategy. A coalition requires leadership. And I think if there's going to be a coalition that includes Russia and others, that it's going to have to be done very carefully, and we're going to need very good leadership and a clear strategy and clear rules of engagement and coordination.
Can you think of a coalition that the United States was involved in that it didn't lead?
I cannot think of one, and
we wouldn't get involved in one.
I would not want to be involved in one with our military forces that we weren't leading. I can't imagine otherwise.
So, so then I sort of take it a step further. So if you can't imagine that, can we imagine Russia getting involved in a coalition that they would allow the United States to lead?
That's hard to imagine also. There may have to be some other arrangement here. Certainly, ISIS is such an evil organization that anybody that's dropping bombs on them, that's good. But at the same time, you have to be very careful in your involvement, I think, with Russia at this time. Keep in mind they still have aggression going on in Ukraine. And I think as a first condition, that needs to cease.
So, but given the fact that there also seems to be a second condition, they would like them to stop bombing the anti-Assad forces that the U.S. has been helping to train. Whether they'll agree to that, obviously, is what Secretary Kerry is working on.
Well, that even raises the question, Chuck, of sharing intelligence.
And you can't coordinate with the Russians if you're not willing to share intelligence, and why would you share intelligence?
I think it would be difficult to have a well-knit, coordinated coalition with a common strategy and common goals and objectives if you can't share some intelligence. And if we start sharing where these anti-Assad forces are, the next thing we know, they may be bombing them again.
So do you think Hollande's going to realize he's going to run into this problem, and then he's going to realize that, does he have no choice but then to go back to the NATO route? He's been trying to avoid invoking the NATO and Article 5, but is NATO the only known coalition that can lead?
I think that we could have a coalition that would consist of NATO and even other countries in the region, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Saudis, maybe even some of the Gulf states, that they could be involved, and then there could be the Russian involvement, and we could coordinate our actions, but it wouldn't necessarily have to be within the coalition. If I were going to do it, I would try something like that.
So stick with NATO. Don't try to do it as an individual country-by-country thing.
I think, and there may be some with better ideas than that, but that's what I would try to do.
All right, Les Brownlee, I think this is going to be a complicated little shuttle diplomacy that Hollande's going to try to pull off.
Yeah, just keep in mind, we still need a strategy and we still need leadership.
Welcome back. We've all been focusing on Decision 2016, but there's still some work to be done on Decision 2015. Tomorrow's the runoff election to succeed Bobby Jindal as governor of Louisiana. The Democratic candidate is John Bel Edwards, and he's trying to make the race about character, attacking his opponent, Republican Senator David Vitter, for that 2007 prostitution scandal. He, of course, put out this hard-hitting ad earlier this month.
Or David Vitter, who answered a prostitute's call minutes after he skipped a vote honoring 28 soldiers who gave their lives in defense of our freedom. David Vitter chose prostitutes over patriots.
Edwards had a sizable poll lead earlier in the month, but Vitter appears to be mounting a comeback, trying to hammer his opponent on Syrian refugees. He put out a new ad Monday accusing Edwards of supporting President Obama on accepting Syrian refugees, though Edwards, like Vitter, is against hosting refugees in Louisiana.
One of the Paris ISIS terrorists entered France posing as a Syrian refugee. Now, Obama's sending Syrian refugees to Louisiana. John Bel Edwards has pledged to work with Obama to bring Syrian refugees to Louisiana.
I supported the president.
He always does.
Joining me now to unpack this unique race in Louisiana, although we've had unique ones there before, is Jeremy Alford. He's publisher and editor of LAPolitics.com. So, Jeremy, like I said, I feel like we're saying this is a unique race, but in some ways, this is not even probably in the top 5 of the craziest races in Louisiana history. That said, what is happening here? Do we think Vitter is making a comeback or not?
Well, look, we're seeing the overnight tracking polls starting to show that conservative voters are coming home to David Vitter. It's been a very gradual, slow pace, though, and it's just, you know, it's hard to tell whether or not it's going to be enough to get over that hump tomorrow in Saturday's election.
What has been the biggest factor in this race? I mean, you know, for the longest time, you look at Kentucky that just took place a few weeks ago, and the Republicans successfully made it a referendum on President Obama. Obviously here, John Bel Edwards and all the Republican candidates during the primary, the open primary, wanted to make this a referendum on Vitter. So has this become a referendum on Vitter more so than Obama?
Yeah, I think so, and it's been all about character. Look, David Vitter has been reelected since the D.C. Madam controversy, and I think that taught us that it takes more than one sex scandal to sink a Louisiana politician. But this time around, it's for governor, and you know that is a storied, legendary position in Louisiana. I think there's more of a personal relationship, and it just mattered more, to the point that we saw David Vitter for the first time really discuss that controversy at length. I mean, he put out a commercial explaining his side of the story, talked about his family, talked about his children, and I think we saw him do that for a reason. But it has been about character, it's been about influence, and both are trying to convince voters of their own argument.
What role has Bobby Jindal's unpopularity played in this race?
Well, I mean, look, the two of the most unpopular officials in Louisiana are Bobby Jindal and Barack Obama. You got David Vitter saying that John Bel Edwards is an Obama liberal Democrat. You also got him saying that John Bel Edwards voted for a majority of Bobby Jindal's budgets. You got John Bel Edwards saying that David Vitter would be a continuation of Bobby Jindal's administration. So it's amazing that the two men that are being talked about most sometimes in this race aren't even on the ballot.
What I can't figure out is who runs the Louisiana Republican Party. It's clear Bobby Jindal lost the Louisiana Republican Party a long time ago, maybe 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, but right when he started running for president, it seemed like locals bailed on him, and I'd get these calls going, you know, he's bailed on Baton Rouge, we never see him, and all this stuff. And I was, you know, everything I heard is that David Vitter had very slowly sort of taken over the party. That clearly was not the case. What happened here?
No, that's definitely not the case. David Vitter has honed a reputation in Louisiana as being a lone wolf. I mean, this is a guy who's really overseeing most of his GOTV and turnout in-house. You know, the state party doesn't really have a role in that. The state party has always been a party that Bobby Jindal helped build, and I think that remains the fact today. And we're seeing that in the way that the Republican politics are playing out in this race.
Who will be able to govern?
I think both men would be ready to govern from day one. You know, you got John Bel Edwards on one side. That's a Democrat who would have to work with the Republican legislature, and then you got David Vitter, who would have to work with the legislature that he's been running attack ads on, more or less. He's running these ads talking about these Baton Rouge politicians.
I feel like neither candidate is going to have a honeymoon to govern. You know, usually there's at least 6 months. Will either one of them be able to have this honeymoon to sort of get their agenda started?
No, and in fact, look, David Vitter and John Bel Edwards got into the budget fight with the legislature in Jindal this week. Both asked the legislature to reject a deficit reduction plan by Bobby Jindal, and then they're going to have to get into it right away. We're talking about some major deficits in the upcoming years, $1 billion or more for the next 5. So there is no honeymoon period. They're going to have to find a nice scotch, settle in, and just embrace the lunacy of the next 4 years.
All right, going into election night, who would you rather be, Edwards or Vitter?
Well, I try not to make predictions, but the polling trends right now do favor John Bel Edwards, with David Vitter starting to see more of his conservative votes come back home. So it's going to be an interesting night in Louisiana.
Less than a field goal?
That's what I'm thinking. It could be a 1 to 3 point race. It could get tight.
And that's my gut, too. Anyway, Jeremy Alford, thanks for your wisdom. Appreciate it.